was wondering if I should make this video. I'm starting to look like a stalker here, I think. Yeah. But puppy turtle, puppy turtle, puppy turtle. Your latest video was, well, how should we put it, rather condescending. Your whole dealing with and saying that, atheists would just criticize whatever route God took, and, he could have taken this, this, or that. Someone else actually, we wouldn't have criticized him over, you know, necessarily. But, what about the routes he could have taken? Why did Yahweh require that they go through and conquer the so-called Promised Land? It makes sense in the context of the Bible because the Jews wouldn't have known much beyond that area. But what was so special about that land? There were much better places that were not necessarily inhabited by anybody, or had less population. Why couldn't they just moved in slowly? Why did it have to be conquering? This huge conquering thing. The people lived there. This was the other people's lands, according to the story of the Bible. The Jews just came in and invaded and conquered them. What happened to the lands they owned? What about the people whose lands the Jews took over? Why couldn't the Jews have moved to a better place? Why didn't they just take over Egypt, for that matter? They just wiped out the Pharaoh and killed most of the... wiped out his army, killed the Pharaoh and most of the firstborns. I'm pretty sure that the Egyptians would have pretty quickly taken them as... let them take over the place, considering they just conquered the country. Why didn't it have to be some other method? And you do take some of the stuff out of context. At least it seems to me when you say that atheists complained about the babies dying when it was when it was God using self-defense and whatnot. No. What we're talking about is the killing of the children during the conquest of the Promised Land. Not if the Jews had genocided or killed all the Babylonians after they invaded. Plus, here's another thing, and I've said it before, I'll say it again. When I criticize Christianity and criticize the Jews, when I sit there and criticize the Jews for the killing of the babies, the genocide, and all these horrible, deplorable acts, if these stories are true, but there was no God existing, that was just the time, as you would say. That's how things happen. I don't really criticize the Jews any more than I would criticize, Babylonians for what they did, or the Egyptians. I mean, we can say they were wrong, but these were just the way they were. But when you have an omnipotent, omnibenevolent, all-powerful God that supposedly loves everybody and supposedly cares about everyone, these actions do not make sense. With all of God's power, why didn't he just create brand new land? Spread the earth, made the earth bigger to allow for new land for the Jews to live on. Why did it have to be conquered land? What was so special about this desert that can barely support things down there? There are much better, more fertile lands nearby that they could have had. Again, this just looks back to the whole idea that this makes sense with the Jewish mindset that was the entire world. They didn't know about the rest of Europe or the rest of Africa. They just knew this small little area. So, this whole argument doesn't work. And guess what? Just because we can't think of a better solution, which we can, but let's say we can't, that does not mean that it automatically says that whatever God did was just. You've been using this entire argument over and over and over again that, that it must have been the perfect way for God to have done it because God is perfect. I'm sorry. That does not hold water. You don't get to just say because you think your God's perfect and loving and all-knowing and all-powerful that whatever route he chose was the best route. You don't just get to arbitrarily say that without any real explanation or even proving your God exists. These stories all fit within the context of sheep herders and people with that mindset and education and knowledge back then. Not the education, knowledge, and mindset of an omnipotent God that you worship. These stories don't make sense. Now, these make sense as myths and stories passed down, not actual events. You know, we're going to keep opposing, we're going to keep pointing these things out, Puppy. I'm glad you make these videos, but seriously, you're not convincing anybody with these arguments. Because you're short in your God, you're making your God weak. Because you're saying your God is only capable of doing these deplorable ways. There was no better, more powerful, more benevolent, more awesome ways he could have done it. Seriously, you're just trying to sound like the creationists that say that, you know, deny what God could have created the universe from the Big Bang and just let everything move on because God was just all-knowing, all-powerful, and intelligent. It could just know that all these events could lead to some intelligent life of some kind. No, you're just using the same arguments they are. And it feels the same way. You're just shortening your God and making him look weak. Is this really what you're trying to do? Make your God look like a deplorable, evil bastard that's weak and can't think of better ways of doing things or even do things better? Come on, seriously. No. You really are insulting your God, quite frankly, to me. I think other people feel the same way.